Hello, and welcome to the Writers and Illustrators of the Future podcast. This is John Gibbon, your host. This podcast is dedicated to aspiring writer and artist and will provide inspiration and tips from top professionals in the field. If you've been listening to this podcast or are new to it, first off, thank you very much. I would also appreciate it if you took a moment to follow the Writers and Illustrators of the Future podcast on whatever platform you use to listen to your podcasts. Today's guest is international best-selling author Elizabeth Wein, best known for her novel Name Verity, whereas for me, she is best known as a winner in Writers of the Future Volume 3, but we're going to get to that in a moment. Hello and welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you. I'm talking to you from Scotland. It's nice to be here.
It's very nice to talk to you all the way over there in Scotland. And before I butcher anything else, I'll just leave it with that right there. So now you were a winner in Volume 3.
Volume 9.
It was Volume 9. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
You winner in Volume 9 with your story Fire. And you had your fellow winners there. Then it was Sean Williams, Eric Flint, Stoney Compton, Kathleen Dalton Woodbury, Brian Lee Durfee, and Carolyn Long. Are you still in touch with any of those folks?
I am occasionally in touch with them. I'm friends with them on Facebook. I'm friends with Carolyn Long and Stoney Compton on Facebook. And I actually bumped into Sean Williams in 2013 at the Brisbane Literary Festival in Australia, which was an amazing meeting because I was very, very excited to meet him again after all those years. Mm-hmm. And he didn't actually realize who I was. And he had read Codename Verity and had loved it. So he was excited to meet me. And it was only sort of after we'd said, "Oh wow, I like your writing," that we realized we'd both been on the Writers of the Future award slate. Yeah.
Wow, that's great. And then it was unfortunate with the recent passing of Eric Flint.
Yes.
That was sad. He had been a judge, as is Sean Williams. But he had been a judge in the contest, and that was tough. He spent a lot of his efforts helping aspiring writers and including them in his series and in his publishing house. He helped give them a start, boot in the pants, whatever, to get their careers launched. He's a really, really nice guy. So I'm just curious, is there any particular aspect to being a winner of Writers of the Future that you feel played a positive role in your trajectory as a writer? And if so, how so?
Well, obviously being told that your writing is any good is always, a great boost. But for me, what was really the most wonderful thing about it was being able to get together with the other authors, because I was out there in the blue at that point. I really didn't know. I knew I wanted to be a writer. I didn't know how you talk to anybody, mm-hmm. how you exchanged ideas and sob stories with people. Mm-hmm. And having the chance to work with all these people was really life-changing for me, eye-opening. And of course, I didn't really know much about the science fiction fantasy field anyway. And they all said, "Oh, come to World Fantasy Con." And they said, "Do you know this person? Do you know that person? Have you submitted stuff to this magazine?" And it was, as I say, it was life-changing.
That's great. And then I think that the story you wrote, what was his relationship to Winter Prince?
Well, I was, although I submitted the story that I wrote, Fire, to the competition legitimately. I did not have a published novel or a published story at all at that point. I was new to the field. By the time that the award ceremony came around, my first book had already been published. And that was, So it was actually in the same month. So it was like, I felt like, my ship had come in at that point.
For sure.
And The Winter Prince was a sort of Arthurian fantasy focusing on King Arthur's son Mordred and his stormy relationship with his siblings, who I'd made up. And Fire was a kind of mini sequel to The Winter Prince, a little epilogue. And it was because these characters were still, very much alive in my head, and I didn't want to let them go. And so I wrote it almost as soon as I finished writing The Winter Prince. And that was the story that I submitted.
That's a cool story how that works. Go ahead though.
No, I was going to say it came second in my quarter, which meant that it did not go on to be entered in, the grand prize competition. Right. And I was so glad that it hadn't, because honestly, because if I had been competing with these other authors for another prize, I don't think I would have enjoyed my experience there as much. I would have been, I hope I win, and who's the competition? And instead I could just kind of sit back and relax and admire everybody and have fun.
That was the year that Carowin won. And just an interesting anecdote on that particular phenomenon you're talking about there. Jerry Purnell used to love going around, and he once he knew who the grand prize winner was, he'd go up to them and say, "Don't worry, it's not you." And so they'd be totally all, just chill now, because, okay, it's not me. The pressure's off. I don't have to worry about it. Is it me or not? And then they'd be called, the camera would be on them, and you just see them totally flustered, like, trying to register because they'd been told they weren't it. And now they're being told they are it. And he used to love playing that game of.
Well, Carowin and I, during that week, became like kind of instant best friends. Mm-hmm. We were, we've drifted apart in the 40 years or whatever it is, 30 years, I think, since then. But we really hit it off very well. She said at one point, "Oh, I feel like I found a sister." And so we were kind of like arm in arm. And at that point, we were both pretty young, and, the cute girl couple walking arm in arm and was this united front. And it was so much fun being part of that little team. And so I felt like I really could root for her without feeling like I was in competition with her as well, which was nice.
Well, that's nice. Yeah. It's interesting how many great friendships, get created each year at the competition. Yeah. And now we're actually going to be publishing volume 39 next April, but we started year 40. So the actual contest for year 40 started the beginning of October. And it's just amazing how long it's been going on. It just gets bigger and bigger and bigger as a contest.
Well, you asked if I was still in touch with anybody. Actually, I had been in touch with my illustrator, Yuri Galitzin. Mm-hmm. And his daughter contacted me when he died quite young. It was maybe 5-10 years ago now, but she put together a really lovely little tribute to his illustration. He had a career as a children's book illustrator, and I think he's from Ukraine.
I think so.
Could be wrong. Yeah. And she got me to write a little tribute to him to include in that. So that was another kind of, nice and touching thing that came out of it.
Yeah, there are a lot of really nice stories about it. And the thing about Writers of the Future and Illustrators of the Future is it's all about storytelling and illustration. We don't get into anything else. It's like the quality of the storyteller, the quality of the artist is what gets celebrated every year. And it just keeps on building and building and building. We're not religious. We're not political. We're not ethnic. We're not nationality. It's just all about storytelling and all about illustration, which makes it really good. So on your writing career now, you've so Arthurian legend is kind of like from what I've been able to gather is what began it all for you. So fantasy has been your at least the start of stuff, and then we'll get into Name Verity, which hardly qualifies as fantasy from my understanding of fantasy. So let's just start first of all with your curve as an author. I believe your first novel was written at the golden age of 7 or some such.
Yeah, kind of. I mean, I had a series. It was like a spin-off of the Hardy Boys, but it was called The Church of Girls, which I was writing with my then best friend. And we did actually complete one of those volumes. I mean, we had like the whole series mapped out, but we did actually complete one of those books. Now, novel is maybe a bit of a grandiose term to use for this thing, but it was a completed story. It was probably, 10 TypeScript pages.
Whoa.
but I did write a novel when I was 11. I wrote a time travel story, and I at that point I said to myself, right, I want to be a writer. I want to write novels. Let's put your money where your mouth is and write something. So I set myself the schedule of 5 pages a day for, I don't know what it was, 3 months or something. And it was all written in yellow legal school tablet, not legal tablets, school tablets. And that thing, my mother typed up for me many years ago when we used typewriters, and and it was about 90 pages long. So I can't tell you how many words it was, but it was a substantial middle grade sized novel at that point. So and that sort of got things rolling. I have written many other novels, including unpublished ones since then. I have never held myself to such a tight schedule as I did back there in 6th grade.
In 6th grade. So now you got lots of little vectors that came together to arrive where you are right now. Education, as well as your travels, as well as what you used to love reading stuff. So how did it all come together? Like, you can pick a vector starting with any one of those points there, lines, and then let's weave them together. So education.
Education. Well, education. So I decided, I was very, very fixated on wanting to be a writer, and I wanted to be a fiction writer. So I actually bypassed some good opportunities to, do journalism or something like that. And I majored in English literature at Yale. And I then went on to get a degree in folklore. I got a PhD in folklore at the University of Pennsylvania. And that's because with the Arthurian background, I was obsessed with Arthurian legend and, by extraction, Celtic literature and Welsh legend. And so I went into folklore thinking, well, this is a way to study myths and legend. And it was, but not in the way I expected. And what I ended up really getting a firm background in is narrative and folk stories and the way motifs work and the way archetypes work. And I also learned to do research. And I have 5 of these sort of quasi Arthurian novels to my name. They're all YA. They're all young adult. But they are set in a historical world. They're fantasy by virtue of their feeling like fantasy and by virtue of their being Arthurian. But they are set in our world, and there's no magic in the background. My editor at the time struggled to come up with a way to classify them, and she came up with the term historical intrigue, or I can't remember exactly what it was, but she was trying to make it sound jazzier than just straight up historical, and historical fantasy suggests that there is a fantastic element to them. And the issue was that they were adventure novels. They were thrillers, but they were set in this 6th century. I actually moved a lot of King Arthur's family and his extended family to Ethiopia, to the ancient kingdom of Aksum, to carry on these stories. So they had a very, I did a lot of research for them, but they also had a very exotic feel to them because they were not set in the Western Dark Ages. They were set at the height of the very civilized Aksumite Empire. And from there, like while I was in the process of publishing these books, I started taking flying lessons. And that's probably the number one thing that changed the course of my writing. My husband had had a pilot's license. He'd already had it, but he'd already got it when I first met him.
Mm-hmm.
And I, we had these plans we were going to fly across America. Of course, we didn't do that because we had a baby instead. But I decided that, darn it, I was going to learn to fly. And when I sold my second book, I actually used the advance to pay for my pilot's license, which I could do at that time. Everything being that little bit cheaper than
yes.
it is now.
Yeah.
And I had a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old at home underfoot that I was looking after, as well as writing and taking these flying lessons. And it was the hardest thing that I have ever done. And I really wanted to write about it. And when my editor put together, my editor at that point was Sharon November, who worked at Viking, and she had her own imprint called Firebird. And she published a lot of fantasy that had gone out of print. She reprinted. And she also published some original anthologies of fantasy or speculative fiction. She tried to be very all encompassing. And that's partly because she was stuck with me writing for her. And so the first story that I gave her was set in 1950s Kenya, and was about this minister's daughter who goes on this, who has gone to join her family on this mission in Kenya, kind of during the Mau Mau rebellion, and she has to fly across Kenya, not by herself, obviously with a pilot, but it's this adventure that she takes. Mm-hmm. And it was based very much on a flight across Kenya that I did with my husband in 1994. And this was wedged into this fantasy anthology. And everybody kind of went, huh? But, they liked the story. And she did another one. And I wrote another short story about flying for it. And that was about a young woman who disguises herself as her dead brother to become a fighter pilot during the Battle of Britain. And at this point, Sharon had decided, she'd figured out how to make this thing fit in with the other stuff. I think that's when she changed the genre to speculative rather than fantasy and science fiction. And that story went down really, really well. And she asked me if I could write a novel that was a bit more mainstream for her, and maybe something set in World War II like that was. And although she didn't end up publishing it, Codename Verity was the result. And Codename Verity.
Yeah, she kicked herself multiple times for having made
No, it wasn't her fault. It wasn't her fault.
Oh, okay.
She wanted that book desperately, and she was not allowed to buy it. And she was very, very unhappy about it.
Wow.
Yeah. So I hope there are people who kicked themselves about it, but
not her.
Not her. She was very, very supportive of it all along. But yeah, it did go to somebody else eventually. And it was Codename Verity it was born of it was my sixth novel. A lot of people think it's my debut novel because they've never heard of me, but it was my sixth novel, and it was born of a tradition of writing spy stories and about kind of people sneaking below the radar and ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And although you go, what, World War II spies and airplanes, how'd you get there from the salt mines of ancient Ethiopia? It's really the characters and what they go through that kind of ties those things together. And after I wrote Codename Verity, well, things sort of took off, no pun intended, from there. And I wrote many other books about young people flying, including a Star Wars book, a middle grade Star Wars novel called Cobalt Squadron, which was the middle grade tie-in to The Last Jedi. And there were so many reasons why I was just thrilled to do that. Finally, I was writing science fiction. Finally, I'm actually writing science fiction.
Yeah.
But also, I've been a Star Wars fan since I was 12, so it was a real thrill to be able to do that.
And also, probably when you saw Sean in Australia, because he's also got a Star Wars novel that he wrote. Well, you guys were able to further bond, and hey, how's that Star Wars? Yeah.
And Dave Wolverton, who was the judge for and the editor for Volume 9. Was also a Star Wars writer.
Yeah, Courtship of Princess Leia. Right.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious because you've got all types of angles on fiction. Is it an issue, or what holds true in storytelling that enables you to move between genres like you do or like you have?
Well, as I said, my stories are very character driven, so that's kind of I think what nails things down for me is I fall in love with the character, whether it's I tend to drift more into fantasy when I write short stories. So I have a short story where the main character gets sort of kidnapped by the Queen of Fairy and has to make a set of bells for her, and stuff like that. So it's still, even in something that's as far out from everything else I've written as that might sound, it's really the characters that draw me in when I'm telling a story. And I've written nonfiction as well. I've written a nonfiction young adult book about the Russian women who flew combat missions in World War II. The most famous of them are the Night Witches, who flew these dinky little planes made out of fabric and balsa wood and harassed the soldiers on the German front all night long for the entire war. And I was asked actually to write this book. And again, it was just the characters that drew me into that, these incredible women. And they were all led by one woman who was very, very charismatic, Marina Roskova, and who managed to kind of play the system to her advantage and got these women to be able to fly. So it always starts with character for me. So
now we're going to move over here for a little bit on Codename Verity, because you're talking about this nonfiction, but then I listened to the audiobook, and I hope that your publisher there got your last name correct finally.
I don't believe they have, actually. I think they've just signed a new contract for it, and they still
mispronounce Wein.
They still mispronounce Wein. Yeah. I wish they'd say Vein, because then, rather than Vine, because at least then I could pretend it was Harriet Vane, my favorite Dorothy Sayers character. But
alas,
alas, no. Despite being told.
Yes. So now you claim it's fiction, but I'm not. It's unclear how much really is fiction versus. I got that you've got these laws of secret material that still stays secret until whenever that's over with. But then you start putting in, when I did the research on the pens, how they could do it, find out, ballpoint pens actually began just prior to that. And it was the British, and it was for the Air Force, and it was, all this stuff is like, wow. And then how many other things are just a coincidental fact? And
well, it is fiction because I made up the story. So it's wearing the trappings of
of truth.
Of truth. Yeah, I'm minded of what did Churchill say? He said, "In wartime, truth is so precious that she must be surrounded by a guard of lies," that's somewhat misquoted.
Concept, yeah.
But something like that. So I mean, the book itself, the story itself, the characters itself, I made them up. They didn't really exist, and the things that they didn't really happen, even to other characters. I mean, to real people.
Right. But what about the girl when she turned the wrong way on the street and she got captured?
And so like all these little things did happen.
Yeah.
but not in the same order and not necessarily to the same people. I mean,
and then the girl that flew the nobody did that except for this one person in Russia. I just reminded me when you said that book that you wrote about the Russian women aviators, like, oh, that's the name you used. That was that person that, okay.
Yeah, no, I do. I sort of steal shamelessly from everywhere. But the thing about Codename Verity is the story of, for listeners who have not actually read it or maybe even heard of it, it's the story of two young women. One is a pilot and one is a spy. They're both they're both British. They're both flying for the working for the Allies during World War II. And one of them is sent on a spying mission to Nazi-occupied France, which goes terribly wrong. And her friend, the pilot, tries to rescue her. And the story really is shaped around their friendship. So it's a spy thriller, but also it's about friendship. And so the story is framed as Verity, the spy character. Verity is her code name, it's not her real name. It's framed as a confession that she's writing for the Nazis. And she's been captured by them, she's been tortured by them, and now she's writing a confession. And so much of what she says is of dubious value. So she's telling them stuff that they can maybe make use of, but not necessarily what they want to hear. And she's also being very protective of her friend in particular, who she knows is at large in France, and she doesn't want to give away. So she disguises a lot of things in her writing. And there was a point where I, as the author, had to sort of sit down and think about what was actually fiction that I was writing and what was like made up garbage that the Verity character was writing. And some of it is true in that it is based on things that happened in World War II. And some of it is true within the fictional world of Codename Verity. And some of it is just completely made up, in no matter how you look at it. One of the things that Maddie, the pilot character, says towards the end of that book is she has told a true story. This is all true. Everything that she says about our friendship and how we work together and what we feel about each other is true. And I feel that that's a comment on fiction. You know, it's a lie, but it tells the truth. So that's I think how you can get away with telling stuff in a fictional story and making stuff up and giving wrong information, because the story, the heart of the story and its meaning to people remains real.
Yeah.
A lot of people. Sorry, I was just rhapsodize about the Verity character. She feels very real to a lot of people. She's a larger than life character, and I've had people name their dogs and their children and after her, and I've had people decide that they're going to go out and learn to fly, and people have become best friends because they've shared this book with each other, and it's been a gift. Mm-hmm. And it is the gift that keeps on giving as well. It's wonderful to have written this book and to see how people share it as well.
Yeah, it's so do you call it historical fiction or is it thriller? How do you call that book?
I do call it historical fiction. Historical fiction is no longer a dirty word, which it kind of was in the beginning of the 21st century when I was writing it for young readers. But partly because of the success of Codename Verity, that is no longer the case. People don't seem to be turned off by the term historical fiction anymore.
Yeah.
And I mean, that really is what it is. It's not really disguising itself as anything else. Although I still maintain that I write adventure stories about young people.
That's fine. It's like Anne McCaffrey on all the Dragon Riders series. She argued, to the grave that she only wrote science fiction, that none of the stuff was fantasy. She
Right.
just, no, this is what it is. It's my story and I'm sticking to it. And she thoroughly explained to me multiple times why it was science fiction, how it was done, how it was verified by scientists, and the whole thing there. It's just, yeah.
There you go.
Yes. So now that book, Codename Verity, hit #1 in the United States in the New York Times. And
10 years after publication.
Really?
10 years after publication in March of 2020, it did that.
Wow. Yep. What caused that to have a second life like that?
Well, so what caused it to make that leap onto the New York Times bestseller list is that it was in a special promotion by Barnes & Noble, where you could buy a coffee and a book for $5. And Codename Verity was that book for the month of February. And that's what booped it up onto the...
That's more than a boop.
Into the #1 position.
That's a wowzer.
It was astonishing to have that happen in March of 2020. And my new publisher, I'm no longer with Disney Hyperion. I'm now with Little Brown. They actually put out a 10th anniversary edition of the book. Sorry, I said that happened 10 years after publication. It wasn't 10 years after publication. It was 10 years after I wrote it. So there was a 10th anniversary edition of Codename Verity that came out in May, I think, of this year, which included a new short story that was connected to the book and a sort of essay by the author and a letter to the reader and an interview. And so it had a lot of new material included in it. And it was, it's still bringing in royalties for me. So
which is great. It's just a lovely story. It's an amazing story. This is the Writers of Future podcast. And so I pretty much talk to science fiction and fantasy authors. And so when I started, listening in preparation, because I never do an interview unless I've actually read at least something from the author. So I reread your Fire, and then I also listened to this audiobook. I actually listened to it a couple times because again, it was getting into a different genre, which I'm not, used to. And it was amazing just how much I enjoyed it. And then that little 10-minute segment on the audiobook where you described some of the different things with the book, and you gave some of the different anecdotes, like the one about the ballpoint pen. Any other things like that in there, which you found out in research that was just like, wow, how it was a very convenient coincidence, like I said, on the ballpoint pen, that you had to have that because she was writing a bunch of stuff and she was going to poke herself dead with getting enough blood to keep on writing her story.
There were loads and loads of things that I kept uncovering as I was writing it. But the one that springs to mind is there's a point you say she's going to poke herself dead to write with it. I will finish this story. I actually had to. She was such a prolific writer. I'm her mouthpiece, I guess, but it felt like she was doing it. She was such a prolific writer that I realized after she'd been writing for a week or whatever it was, that if I didn't stop her, because she had been given a certain amount of time to do this, and that this book was going to be 1,000 pages long. So at that point, the plot was driven by the fact that I had to stop her writing, and I had to take I had to take away her paper. and what this so she's writing this confession in this repurposed hotel that the Nazis have taken over in this little city in France, and she's writing on unused hotel stationery. And so they run out of that, and she's looking for more paper. She wants to keep writing, and she finds all these old recipe cards, and then she finds all these old prescription sheets. And I went looking for, it was really interesting for me as a writer to think about, well, they're not going to waste nice paper on her. They're not going to give her special paper. And plus she's using up a lot of paper. So they're going to repurpose stuff. And I was thinking, well, what is going to be lying around? What will they be able to find? Eventually she writes on some sheet music that has, they found in the lobby of the hotel by the old piano or something. And when I went to do to use the prescription forms, these virtual prescription forms, I thought, well, I better look them up and see what they look like, and what a prescription form in France looked like in, say they dated a few years before the war. And what I found was these, I didn't know these existed. I found these special prescription forms that you had to use if you were a Jewish doctor under Nazi occupation. So you could only write prescriptions for other Jews. You had to have a specially imprinted form that showed you were Jewish. And I was just like, oh my God, you are kidding me. And of course, I mean, we know this, we know that these kinds of restrictions were put on people, but it's the little everyday details that don't ever occur to you. And it was that kind of thing, like the ballpoint pen, that
right.
I was just really fascinated by. Another thing was there's one point where I don't know, she's constantly battling with her guards, and she has this kind of running relationship going with, she has one female guard who is a German girl, and this young woman reads what she's written every day after she's written it, and is sort of sitting there impatiently waiting to be given the next part of the story. And at one point, Verity tells this story of how she's given a pen nib that they're scrapping. They do a lot of scrapping, and Verity bends the pen nib so it doesn't work. And the guard then shows her how, when she was at school, a nurse used to use a pen nib to do a blood test and pricks her finger with it. And I found this out again, going, okay, well, what's she writing with? She's not writing with a ballpoint pen because they hadn't been invented yet. She's writing sometimes with a pencil, sometimes with a fountain, well, probably not a fountain pen, but an ink pen. And so what happens if you break your pen nib? Well, they had boxes of pen nibs, and you find this stuff on eBay. It's like, oh yeah, there's a box of German pen nibs. And people tell little stories about these things. And one of the stories was how the nurse in this German school used to do a blood test by pricking your finger with a pen nib. So again, just like tons and tons of just everyday life stuff that you unearth, that there isn't really any, it's not thrilling. It's not hugely significant, but being able to add that into the story gives it, I think makes it feel very real. But there were a lot of little details like that I ran into.
That's great. See, one of the things about your story, and probably true in other things that you've written, but that's the one that, I've prepared this podcasts over is the degree that you have those points of fact and these factual historical things that occurred. I couldn't tell where the fact ended and the fiction began. It made it such a smooth transition. And it seems like, because one of the next questions I'm going to ask you is recommendations to aspiring writers or even writers trying to get that next level up on what's important in telling a good story.
Well, what I tell kids when I talk to them, because I talk to a lot of school groups, and there are plenty of aspiring writers among those groups, is write about something that you're passionate about. And honestly, I don't think there's anything more important that I could say to an aspiring writer. You have to love what you're writing about.
Right.
And you don't, everybody always says, write about what you know. It helps to write about what you know, but what you really need to write about is what you love. And I think that just adds a level of, it drives the writing. And
for me, there was a lot more sincerity that I got from that because of what you had there. It was like, people were so real to me in Verity, that both of your protagonists there, but the antagonist was also
yeah. Well, so this is the other thing that I was going to, I write very character driven stuff. So
yeah.
I can't, when I started out to make up the antagonist, so this is all the characters who are in charge of the Nazi prison, and Verity has been interrogated by a guy who is pretty high up the feeding chain, but not at the top. And he just started sprouting. He started out as this like really your typical Nazi interrogator, and he started sprouting all these like personality traits. And it turned out to, have this love of literature and of music, and very specific love of literature. He's like really kind of interested in reading subversive stuff. So he reads stuff that's been banned in Nazi Germany, and he has a daughter that he has carefully sent to boarding school in Switzerland so that she's in a neutral country. And so like he has all this stuff going on that which she eventually extracts from him. And he turns out to be quite a complicated person.
Yeah.
And who is intrigued by her. And I often get asked, well, why does he let her? Sometimes people say, well, this book isn't very realistic because this guy just let her write all this stuff. I'm like, can you not tell? He's fascinated by her, and she reminds him of his daughter. It's like, it's not hard.
Exactly.
Yeah, he is actually a human being, despite the fact that he's a Nazi interrogator. I know it's hard for us to remember that these people were human because they seem so inhuman. And I feel that their humanity almost makes them more scary. Mm-hmm. that the fact that they can have all these outside interests and be so refined and have people that they love and care about and still do these things is really scary, because that could be your next door neighbor or maybe you. So I don't know. Sometimes I worry that in another life I was a Nazi interrogator.
It came so easy to you, right?
How do I get into the heads of these people?
Well, you got in the heads of also these pilots, and you got everybody's head.
Everybody's head. Yep. The other piece of advice that I would give is details really make a story come alive. They always make a story come alive for me. So those, pen nibs and the sheet music that you're writing on, that really very concrete details, I find, make a story come to life. And I actually did this in Cobalt Squadron, in my Star Wars book. I did like the same kind of everyday stuff. So I made up this thing that synthesizes fruit but it's a cranky machine, and and let's say there's stuff on the table where this is the kind of stuff that I love in a science fiction book myself. So just think about like the details of what your characters are going to have to because they're living, no matter, even if they're at war or they're in space or they're trapped in a cave somewhere, nevertheless, they have to sustain themselves with food and warmth and light and all these things that we just do on a daily basis. And those little details, I think, can really lift a piece of writing to a higher level.
Yeah. Now, what about, you obviously do a lot of research in your stories that you do, just background, getting the setting, the environment, that type of personality. And I've gotten this when I've talked to the various writers on other interviews, the importance of not putting all this information down, look how much I know about this thing here, but that creates that personality. And maybe it's nothing more than that they would act or react a certain way because of what they are, so that someone who's reading would actually gain that understand. Oh, I understand this person now. You don't have to say, when we're talking about the desert, all the different qualities of a desert, but the effect of the desert, you automatically know all these other things that you don't have to now write.
Right.
I mean, I'm assuming that there's a lot of stuff that you have, that you learned, that you uncovered as you were doing your research for Verity, Codename Verity, that isn't in the book, but that made the book, or makes the book, that much more real.
Yeah. So one of the things that that people who don't get along with Codename Verity don't like about the book, that I hear again and again, is that it has too many, this I quote, too many technical details. And that is because it is a book about flying. Now, here's the thing. Had I wanted to put in technical details about flying, there would have been a lot more technical details in that book. So, the reader doesn't need to know about engines, the reader does need to know certain things. So there's a plane that gets hit by gunfire and it becomes very difficult to fly. And so there is a little bit of explaining to you why it's doing what it's doing, because it becomes so that it only wants to go up. You can't make it go down, or it takes a lot of strength to make it go down. And so you do need a little background to understand that, or to make it plausible, at the very least. But I'm not going to give you like the whole explanation of what's going on there, because you would go blind, Well, you listen to the audiobook. You would turn off the audiobook, or fast forward or something.
Right.
And I got so fed up with people accusing me of having included too many technical details in this book. There's like one paragraph where there are two places where I think it comes up. There's one paragraph very close to the beginning where Verity says, okay, they told me to write about planes, so I'm going to write about planes. And she says, here is a plane that I have heard of. You can fold up its wings and put it in a truck for easy transportation. And that's kind of the limit of the technical details. But then there's this other point where she's talking about radar and what it looks like when you're looking at a radar screen, an early radar screen, and what the happens when there's an air battle going on. You see the lights coming together, and each of those lights represents an airplane. And to anyone who reads this and thinks this is her giving you technical details, I say you need to
chill.
No. It frustrates me so much. It frustrates me so much because this is this like huge metaphor for like life. These points of light on this screen, each one represents a life. And when the light goes out, a whole air crew has gone out with it. And this comes back later on in the book because they're green lights, and there's this theme of the green flash, and Verity's own life is compared to a green light. And the whole thing is just an extended metaphor. And if all you're seeing is technical details, I feel like you're not reading deeply enough. I mean, I do appreciate that it's a difficult book and it's a literary book, so maybe the technical details are too hard to get beyond to get to the metaphor. But it does frustrate me, and it frustrated me so much that in Rose Under Fire, I wrote a whole section based on the principles of flight, and each section talks about a different principle of flight. There are 4 principles of flight: so lift, drag, weight, and thrust. And the main character, Rose, uses each one of these principles, describes a little bit how it works and what it means and what it does when you're flying. And then she turns it into this extended metaphor for what's going on in her life. And I just sat there going, ha, ha, ha. You wanted technical details? I've given you technical details, and no one has ever complained about it. No one has ever said, "Oh, that bit was boring." They're all like, "Oh, this is such a lovely little metaphor." So
that's
you just have to be careful. The answer to your question is don't overwhelm people with information.
right. But by having all the information, by you're having that knowledge of what they are about, the type of person it is, makes it easy for me to like not distinguish between what's actually happening and what's not, because you've created that persona that I can then understand. I can feel, I can either sympathize with them or I can antagonize with them, but like I know that person. So when they do something else, it's that transition to the science fictional aspect of it, or the fantastical, or the fictional part of it that just happens.
And this is kind of patting myself on the back, but I feel like I've done my job well, if that's the case. And that is really, that's what we want to do when we're telling the story of a fictional character. We want the reader to relate to that character, even if they don't like that character. You know, we want the reader to think, wow, this feels like a real person. And if it's somebody that is likable, or that they, you know, sort of share characteristics with, we want them to go, oh gosh, I really do sympathize. And I don't know, it feels like that's the whole point.
Yeah,
is to make you empathize with the character.
Yeah, and then I think part of the story itself too, in Codename Verity, and that's how much do you think is important in telling a fiction story to have like a theme or a message, or what is it?
I actually don't want to preach to my readers. I don't want to tell them what decisions they should make, or what's good or what's bad. I want them to decide that for themselves. But I do have one theme that kind of thunders through everything I've ever written, and that is take responsibility for your own actions. And I feel that this applies to my good guys and my bad guys. That, you know, if you've done it, you need to own it. But the other thing that I've found is that every book that I write does actually have a theme. And I said that Codename Verity is a book about friendship. I didn't really know that until I'd written it. Very often I will go back and I'll look at it and I'll go, oh, that's what that was about. So yeah, I do it time and again. Yeah, I have a book. I was going to say I have a book coming out in March, another called Stateless, which is another flying book about young people. And its underlying theme is Europe. I didn't plan that.
Okay, good. So this is fiction or nonfiction?
It's fiction. It's a novel.
Okay, that's great. It's so that comes out in spring of 2023.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Elizabeth. And thank you for listening. Subscribe to the Writers of the Future podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We've also been syndicated on the United Public Radio Network, where you can find these podcasts as well. I also want to thank Carnation for sponsoring this show. We really appreciate your support on this. And just for anybody listening, Carnation only tastes good. In my humble opinion, they've got good taste. Writers of the Future series can be purchased wherever books are sold in the US, Canada, the UK, Australia, and South Africa, and available everywhere via Amazon.com. Writers and Illustrators of the Future are contests created by L. Ron Hubbard to provide a means for the aspiring writer and artist to be seen and acknowledged. It is free to enter and open to amateur short story writers and artists of science fiction or fantasy. Again, thank you very much, Elizabeth.
Yeah, thank you.
Hello, and welcome to the Writers and Illustrators of the Future podcast. This is John Given, your host. This podcast is dedicated to aspiring writer and artist and will provide inspiration and tips from top professionals in the field. If you've been listening to this podcast or are new to it, first off, thank you very much. I would also appreciate it if you took a moment to follow the Writers and Illustrators of the Future podcast on whatever platform you use to listen to your podcasts. Today's guest is international bestselling author Elizabeth Wein, best known for her novel Name Verity, whereas for me, she is best known as a winner in Writers of the Future Volume 3, but we're going to get to that in a moment. Hello and welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you. I'm talking to you from Scotland. It's nice to be here.
It's very nice to talk to you all the way over there in Scotland. And